This video is sponsored by Aces of Thunder. Oh, I'm seeing some dust clouds. Well, he's still flying, so we're chilling. I'm just holding down the trigger at this point, hoping we get shots on. Oh no, that's not good. No. So, Gaijin just released a new game, Aces of Thunder, which is an aerial combat simulator focused on iconic aircraft from both the First and Second World Wars. What makes this game interesting is the fact that it's designed fully around virtual reality, which means you can not only look around as if you're really sitting in the cockpit of your aircraft, but you can also use your VR controllers to directly interact with your aircraft's throttle, joystick, and bill. That said, Aces of Thunder can also be played in a more traditional manner. The game runs perfectly fine on the standard monitor, and you can use your own controller or HOTAS set to control your aircraft if you like. If you're interested, you can get Aces of Thunder right now on both Steam as well as PlayStation. Click the first link in the description or the pinned comment to learn more. Oh, BF-109. Must give chin scratches. Scratchy, 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 scratchy. Giving some chin scratches to the plane. Nothing weird about that. Nothing weird about that. So, as I mentioned, in this game you get to fly aircraft from both World Wars. Specifically, there are 4 fighters from World War I, including the iconic Sopwith Camel, as well as 20 other World War II aircraft. Now, while single-player content does exist in Aces of Thunder, I myself, Gwelfitch, age 5, am primarily interested in dogfighting other players in online matches. Of course, if you want to win in such a match, you'll likely want to bring along a competitive fighter. But which aircraft in Aces of Thunder is the most competitive? To answer this question, I've decided to make a tier list. But before I get started with this tier list, there's one thing that's really important to keep in mind. Within Aces of Thunder, multiplayer matchups are historical. For example, the Americans can fight both the Japanese and the Germans, but they'll never be matched up against the British. And as such, comparing UK and US fighters doesn't make much sense given the context of Aces of Thunder. So instead of making a tier list based on objective performance, I'll be ranking all of the aircraft in this list based on vibes, as well as how much fun I had flying them. Also, in Aces of Thunder, there are 24 unique aircraft. This includes 4 planes from World War I, as well as 5 different World War II heavy fighters / dive bombers like this de Havilland Mosquito. However, for this tier list, I'll only be looking at the 15 World War II fighters that come in the base version of Aces of Thunder. There are technically some more aircraft that you can get your hands on if you buy the deluxe version of this game, but I was only given the standard version, so I didn't get to try these aircraft, and therefore I won't be putting them in my tier list. Anyway, with all of that in mind, let's finally get started. I'll be going from left to right, which means the first thing we're looking at will be the American P-51C. In my opinion, this is a great first plane to look at. Its flight performance is quite straightforward. It's got a powerful engine, making it relatively quick, and the airframe is overall very decent for energy fighting. But perhaps more importantly, this plane is incredibly stable. As such, I think the P-51C makes for a great aircraft if you're a newer player, as it's really easy to fly and very forgiving. That said, unfortunately, that's where the positives end. I found that in Aces of Thunder's multiplayer matches, most of the time, the plane with the best turn performance is the plane that wins the dogfight. And unfortunately, the P-51C isn't the best turn fighter. It's fine against the Germans, but when you're going up against the Japanese, which overall have amazing turn fighters, which we'll get to later, I found that the P-51C just ends up feeling a little bit mid. In fact, I would argue that the P-51 is so mid that it functions as a great middle-of-the-road benchmark for the rest of the tier list. As such, I'll be putting the P-51C in C tier. Now, before we move on, the keen-eyed among you will probably have noticed that the gameplay in the background has not been recorded in VR. And of course, when you're not playing this game in VR, you can't use your VR controllers to fly the aircraft. Thus, I've resorted to using a HOTAS set. And this is where I want to give a huge thanks to Thrustmaster. Like I mentioned, this video is sponsored by Aces of Thunder, and as a part of that sponsorship, I've received from Thrustmaster their Warthog HOTAS set, which includes an A10C replica throttle and joystick. Now, I'll admit I'm not the biggest knower of sim hardware, but I can tell you that the toggle switches on the base of the throttle sound and feel amazing. I mean, listen to this. So again, huge thanks for Thrustmaster for sending me one of their Warthog HOTAS sets. Anyway, on with the next aircraft. The P-47 felt a lot like the P-51, just slightly worse. In theory, this aircraft does have some strengths, but in practice, many of those were just basically completely irrelevant given the context of Aces of Thunder's multiplayer matches. All in all, I would put this slightly lower than the P-51C, in D tier. Out of the three fighters available for the US, the P-63 is by far the most interesting. Unlike the P-47 and P-51, this plane is incredibly snappy, making it difficult to fly and honestly very unforgiving if you get close to its limits. But if you can master the airframe, I sense that this would likely be a relatively strong pick. That said, because this thing's so unforgiving, I still find it hard to give it a high rating. I do think the P-63 is slightly better than the P-51, primarily because the guns are more interesting and because the cockpit is slightly better, but still, I'm putting this thing in C tier. Next up are the German fighters. The Bf-109G2 and the Bf-109F4 are basically identical. There are some subtle differences, but those differences weren't all that noticeable given the context of Aces of Thunder's multiplayer. Importantly, I think these two both fly quite nicely. When you push them close to their limit, they do get a bit snappy, but overall, their turn performance felt fine, and they also felt like relatively decent energy fighters. I don't think they're the best dogfighters in this game, but they were genuinely satisfying to fly. Or at least they are for the most part, because unfortunately they do get terrible cockpit visibility. In fact, if you're trying to look behind you, you can't. There's just a big plate blocking your view, and as such, while I think these are competitive fighters, they were a bit frustrating to dogfight with. And therefore, I'll be putting both of the Bf-109s in B tier. The Focke-Wulf 190 is, bad. I mean, its guns are fine, its cockpit visibility is decent, but the flight performance is just not that great. Technically, if you get good at managing the flaps, then you could get some extra turn performance out of this thing, but overall, I just rather fly the Bf-109s. I'm putting the Focke-Wulf 190 in E tier. Unlike the Germans, the British get three very different airframes. First up, let's look at the Spitfire. On paper, this thing is awesome. The cockpit visibility is great, the guns are decent, and the flight performance is very competitive. However, it's also quite treacherous. While the Spitfire can turn incredibly well, there is a very fine line between turning very well and turning so much that your wingtips start to snap all over the place, and when that happens, it's very easy for this plane to enter a flat spin. Long story short, while the Spitfire is definitely a competitive dogfighter, it can also be quite a handful to fly. Therefore, while I do think this plane is a bit more interesting than the Bf-109s, I'll be putting it in B tier. Out of every aircraft that'll be on this tier list, the Typhoon Mark 1B late has been the most difficult to place. Not only does it arguably have the best cockpit in the game, but it also comes armed with 4 20mm cannons, and its flight performance is very good for an energy fighter. Unfortunately, being a good energy fighter doesn't seem to get you very far in Aces of Thunder's multiplayer matches. And as such, I found that dogfighting with the Typhoon was quite difficult. Now, to be clear, that could very well be a skill issue, but given the fact that this tier list is based on my enjoyment of each aircraft, I'm going to be putting the Typhoon in C tier. That said, I did enjoy flying this plane more than the American offerings, and as such, this will be the best C tier plane on this list. Britain's last fighter, if you can call it that, is the Firefly. This thing goes straight into F tier. It feels sluggish, heavy, and overall isn't very good. It feels like the Soviet LA-5 suffers from a similar issue. To be clear, this thing is nowhere near as bad as the Firefly, but it still feels a lot more sluggish than what I was expecting. So even though the cockpit visibility of this thing is fine and its guns are great, I'll be putting it in D tier. In fact, I'll be putting it slightly behind the P-47. Fortunately, the other two Soviet aircraft more than make up for the lackluster LA-5. Let's start with the Yak-3. In my opinion, this plane is incredible, especially compared to the German aircraft that it goes up against. It's got phenomenal cockpit visibility, great guns, and very good flight performance. In fact, the flight performance of the Yak-3 is so good that I often found myself effectively running circles around the enemy. All in all, I think this plane easily deserves a spot in A tier. The Yak 9T is the Yak 3's weird brother. These two planes are effectively identical, except the Yak 9T trades in one machine gun in exchange for a much larger main cannon. And in my opinion, that cannon is incredibly fun to use. For one, it's still mounted directly in the nose of the aircraft, making it relatively easy for you to line up your shot. However, because the fire rate of this cannon is also relatively low, you have to be very deliberate about when you pull the trigger. And honestly, almost nothing else in this game is more satisfying than timing your shot perfectly and watching your 37mm shell blow apart the enemy's aircraft. So while the Yak 9T is arguably a bit harder to use than the Yak 3, in my opinion, it's also a lot more satisfying and entertaining. Therefore, while I'm putting both of these in A tier, I'll be putting the Yak 9T in front of the Yak 3. And with that, we have arrived at the last nation, Japan. And arguably, we have saved the best for last. Out of the 3 fighters available for Japan, the Kai-61 is probably the least interesting. Though that's not to say it's bad. In fact, I think this plane easily belongs in B tier. However, I am putting it slightly behind the Spitfire, as I simply found the Kai-61 to be a lot more forgettable. The same can't be said for the J2M2. When I first flew this plane in VR, I was kind of taken aback at how absolutely massive the cockpit feels. Like, seriously, your mom could almost fit in here. Jokes aside, the J2M2 felt very satisfying to fly. Not only does it seem to turn very well compared to the American aircraft that you're going up against, but more importantly, it's also pretty good at holding on to energy. And as such, it feels relatively easy to just throw this plane around while simultaneously clowning on your competition. Pair that with decent armament which easily shreds the enemy's aircraft, and you end up with a fighter that simply belongs at the top of A tier. Last, but certainly not least, the A6M3-0. Honestly, this thing is just straight up nuts. In fact, I don't think it's fair that this aircraft gets to go up against the stuff that the Americans have. For context, this plane really only has 2 weaknesses. For one, it's relatively easy to set on fire, though that's basically irrelevant as long as you don't get hit. 2, the Zero is relatively slow, especially compared to the American aircraft that you're going up against. However, in the context of Aces of Thunder's multiplayer, I haven't found this speed difference to be a problem, or even remotely relevant. Thus, what you're left with is a plane that's effectively the perfect dogfighter. Not only does it have decent guns and relatively good cockpit visibility, but most importantly, it has flight performance that is simply unmatched by any other World War II fighter in the game, at least in terms of turn performance. And given that turn performance seems to be the most decisive factor in Aces of Thunder's multiplayer, in my opinion, the A6M3-0 belongs nowhere else but S tier. And there you have it, my personal Aces of Thunder World War II fighter tier list. Of course, this is a subjective list, like I said, it's based on how much fun I had in each of these planes, but still I'm curious to hear what you think of my rankings. Let me know in the comments. That said, once again, huge thanks to Aces of Thunder for sponsoring this video. Right now you can buy Aces of Thunder on both Steam as well as PlayStation. Click the first link in the description or the pinned comment to learn more. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching, and if you liked this video, then maybe also click the one that's currently shown to you on screen. It's a little bit different, but kind of the same, so I think you'll enjoy that video as well.